Hello, I'm Derren from Manchester Met. My background is in making websites. I now teach the practical side of making websites and I'm working on a PhD. The area of web history I'm looking at is responsive web design, which was a reaction to the introduction of touchscreen internet-enabled devices. And I'm taking responsive web design to be a reconfiguration of web design following Suchman and Enkerson. And I found this to be a really interesting period to study because this is something that happened to me. When I was a web designer, web developer, it was an overwhelming time because everything became suddenly much more complex, designing, developing for all these multiple screen sizes and input types. So in terms of my research questions, how do web workers formulate good practice? When and how is change implemented? The sort of theoretical background to that are things like how do self-organizing communities evolve and support themselves? How do they regulate? How code might be a rhetorical practice which helps create this community as well. How code exists in wider context, platformization, website ecology. All of these theoretical ideas are helping me kind of work through the things that I'm looking at in terms of studying responsive web design. The first thing I wanted to do was to look at the change over time. So I obviously needed to use the Internet Archive to get at older versions of websites. So I started playing around with the Internet Archive and its API, and I built a system where you can feed it a list of URLs and it will go and look for the meta viewport tag, which is one way of telling whether a website understands the world of responsive web design. And we can see here a graph of the UK university website slowly going responsive over time. 2011 is a big point in time where the graph really starts to head off, and in 2017 we have 90% of websites going responsive. Because it's a system, I can feed it any list of URLs. So I've got France, Netherlands, New Zealand, Denmark. We can see that New Zealand goes to 100% by 2017. The other countries aren't quite there yet. Again, we get this inflection point in 2011, and obviously we need to think about how we can sort of account for the difference in speed of change of all of these different countries in terms of their websites going responsive. So that's one side of it. The other side of it is responsive web design is HTML and CSS working together, and there's very few people that seem to be studying CSS, but I think it's really interesting as it's design expressed in code. And for responsive web design, it's multiple designs expressed in code. So I built a different tool to see if I can retrieve the CSS and HTML of archive sites, and it works reasonably well. It's got a few issues still, but it obviously shows you that responsive web design had this effect or was part of this change in CSS. It became much more complicated. It started to add all these things to help you to lay out and design web pages. So I'm really interested in where that stuff came from and how it was governed and how it was kind of implemented. Related to that, we've got this issue that we've found in terms of making sure that the Internet Archive understands how the CSS and HTML work together. We have these platformized practices where we have different ways of adding CSS to HTML. And sometimes you have to go in and actually help the Internet Archive figure out, yes, it does have the HTML, it does have the CSS, it just doesn't quite understand how they fit together because of these platformized practices. Web designers are very good at exploiting the differences between different web browsers created by these big corporations, so that's quite interesting as well. The Internet Archive's access via URI isn't necessarily an ideal fit for chasing the switch to responsive web design. It'd be good to be able to search across an entire corpus of websites for particular source code tags or techniques. So that's something that I think trying to work on with other colleagues about how we could possibly do that. And then finally, we have the archived JavaScript, CSS, HTML, things like that. We have those bits and pieces in archives, but if you've ever made a website, the code that you actually type in yourself on a computer keyboard isn't the code that normally ends up on the website. There's all these other things. There's transpiling going on, content management systems. Nobody is totally in charge of the code that they're writing anymore. And to me, in order for me to be able to tell my story, I need to have those things archived. I need to sort of be able to see those changes over time. So that's my kind of final question. where do we archive the things that make up websites, so we can tell those stories about them in the future. Thank you very much.